Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to episode 3 of the Black Male Study Sessions. My name is Torraine Walker. This is a series of discussions and roundtables focused on addressing the issues affecting Black men and boys. This series is sponsored by the African American Men's Historical Society. The AMHIS is a Black American men's intellectual society focused on the preservation, history, and empowerment of Black men. Go to amhis.org to learn more and visit their Substack at amhissubstack.com. The subject for today is looking for Black male privileges. Black men are at or near the bottom of every American socioeconomic metric. Black men have the lowest employment numbers. Black men have the highest numbers of incarceration and some of the lowest rates of positive physical and mental health outcomes in the United States. But feminist and gender studies rhetoric says that Black men are privileged because of their maleness, no matter their economic status. I want to investigate how this way of thinking gained prominence, and joining me to unpack this issue is Professor Tommy J. Curry. Professor Curry is the personal chair of Africana Philosophy and Black Male Studies, Department of Philosophy at the University of Edinburgh School of Philosophy, Psychology, and Language Sciences. He's also the editor of Black Male Studies, a series exploring the paradoxes of racially subjugated males, Temple University Press. He's also the editor of Decolonial Philosophy and Philosophy Compass. And most importantly, and what most people know him for, he is the author of The Man Not, Race, Class, Genre, and the Dilemmas of Black Manhood, the winner of the 2018 American Book Award. So, Dr. Curry, how you doing this afternoon for where I am and evening for where you are? Hopefully he can hear me. If everybody can hear me, put up a 100, just to be sure we're all coming through clearly. Let's see, waiting on Dr. Curry to get in. Okay, good, good. Bear with us for a second. We might have a little bit of technical difficulties. Dr. Curry, if you can hear me, I sent you the invite. If you just tap that, come on in. All right, I think we have Dr. Curry now. Dr. Curry, how you doing? Go ahead and unmute.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yeah, you're coming through loud and clear now.
Fantastic. I'm telling you,
Awesome.
technology works until it doesn't.
Yep, true enough. It's all good. We've been through it enough.
I'm
Uh,
doing well, brother. I'm doing well.
okay, well, that's good. I'm glad you could take time out of your schedule to have this conversation with me. And also, always thanks to everybody who's coming through to listen to the Black Male Study Sessions. Um, well, let's get into it. I think you heard pretty much everything I said in the intro, and I talked about how, you know, the idea of feminist and gender studies rhetoric is completely opposite to what the data says when it comes to the socioeconomic status of Black males and this idea of Black males being privileged. So let's get right into it.
hmm
Where did this philosophy of universal male privilege come from, and how did it end up pertaining to Black men?
Well, as we've discussed previously, we've known that white feminists have had quite a historical agenda against black men. From the beginning of the 19th century, you see these remnants from the suffrage movement, where white feminists did not want black men to hold the ballot. They thought that black men were savages, that they should not or were not rational enough to dictate the will and interests of white women, and that they belonged in positions of servitude. Now, remember, in the late 1800s, the ballot represented the ability of people to rule over others. The idea of having the right to vote was suggested that you get to determine the fate and future of other groups of people. And white women historically have thought that they were the most fit behind educated white men to dictate the course of civilization and American democracy. Now, once black men were emancipated and given the right to vote, there was a horrible fallout. Black men were called rapists. Lynchings increased. The very notion of black men being free was met with punishment and death. So the idea here was that black men got an undeserved right, and that was spoken about as kind of a civilizational privilege. Now, second wave feminism did not have a specific notion of black male privilege. And this is the irony. You have to remember that for most of history, even white feminist thinkers well into the 1970s and 80s did not believe that black men were patriarchs. They thought black men were rationally unfit, that they didn't have a culture similar to white people, and they were not evolved enough to develop patriarchy. The first time I ever ran across the idea that black men were privileged, it came from texts in the late 70s, suggesting that black men were utilizing violence such as rape to dominate black women. But even though they talked about this as kind of a male power, male desire for power, the word privilege and patriarchy wasn't actually used there. So it's not until you get into the early 80s with the rise of black feminism, authors like Bell Hooks, Jean Noble, etc., who started arguing that the specific kind of violence that black men can use against black women, such as intimate partner violence or domestic violence, we talked about a few weeks ago, or rape, that those specific forms of male domination gave black men privilege. Now, what's important to understand is that we live in an era of academic production where sound bites and ideology are more important than actual research. To date, there's not a single academic article that discusses the development of patriarchy within Black communities. There's been accusations saying that black men would like to imitate white men, that black men want to be patriarchs, that black men are trying to reclaim manhood, but nothing that structurally and culturally situates black men as desiring patriarchy and, in fact, having sociological, economic, or political privilege over black women. Now, this is a very important point. When we understand patriarchy within white society, we understand terms like militarism, capitalism, unjust enrichment, disproportionate political power. None of those things exist among black people in the United States, precisely because they're a group that's dominated within an internal colony that's run by white administrators and white supremacists. The fact that you saw how easily Trump won suggests that there's no actual system of patriarchy or black economic power that can overcome the at-large structure. Now, the notion that black men have privilege isn't really used as a sociological fact. It's used as the basis of a gender war that doesn't have very much empirical evidence. We have to start identifying when we're dealing with facts versus ideology. And the notion of a black male privilege is largely ideological. Black men score the lowest in terms of college matriculation. They have the lowest life expectancies. They have the highest incarceration rates. They're targeted most by police violence and premature police homicides. And despite all this, we still walk with this idea that black men are privileged compared to their black female counterpart. And the danger of this, I think, are apparent. It's not just in the failure of organizations like BLM, where you saw poor working class black men and black communities being over policed and incarcerated and surveilled. It also comes from who gets to benefit from the murder, incarceration, and oppression of poor working class black men. Said differently, we have an economic class of black liberals and black feminists who use the deaths of poor working class black men and their danger as a talking point within white liberal institutions to gain fellowships, prestige, and a public platform. Under Obama's presidency, you saw the proliferation of these ideas. So think about it. Around 10 years ago, when there was a wide attention given to the murder of innocent black men by police, you simultaneously had Black academics, black pundits suggesting that black men were trash, dangerous, and privileged. When the data came out to show that black men were over 97% of the black people killed by black police officers, you had intersectional theorists come out saying, well, even the recognition of black men as victims of homicide compared to black women was a form of privilege. Privilege becomes this malleable idea that feminists and liberals get to use to erase the concrete suffering that black men and boys endure within America's tyrannical state. And I think you can see now that since political violence has become so apparent under the reign of Trump, part two, that the kind of violence that's being imposed on other groups that are non-black is signals of oppression and fascism. So I think what black people have to start wrestling with is how is it that what's being termed political violence, right, or fascist violence that white people are now afraid of in America was the basis of saying that black men were privileged. So the same kinds of killings that we saw a few days ago, right, with Kirk, and the hundreds of black men that were publicly executed by cops because they believed they served a threat, get talked about in two different ways. Right wingers are now saying this is an example of the danger and vulnerability they have and political repression for their ideas. Innocent black men were saying that we're being killed, incarcerated, ignored, and oppressed. And we had black academics saying that that very same violence, when applied to a black male body, was privilege. So what we're dealing with as a black community is the inability to fully conceptualize the humanity of black men and integrate them into a viable political program for black liberation.
I want to get into that a little bit further because I think that's a fascinating parallel that you drew between the killing of Charlie Kirk and the reaction to it from the right wing and people who are considered themselves conservative, and the reaction to the killing of men like Darren Seals and George Floyd and young men like Mike Brown,
Hmm.
because it's almost like on the one side, you see where people on the right can make the parallel to say that because this man was possibly perceived as a threat to the power structure, that might have tied into why he was killed. Where on the other side, you
Hmm.
have this dichotomy going on where you have some people saying that what's happening to black men is horrific, but it's not related to anything connected to anything political or anything related to their gender.
Hmm.
And you have other people on the other side, like you just laid out, saying that just by the fact that these were men who were killed by the state, even acknowledging the fact that they were men that were killed by the state, even though there's an overabundance of the male gender who's been killed by the state, that's taken away attention from other people who are marginalized in the community. Can you get into that a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm always reminded of the words of this genocide historian, Amy Randall. She pointed out that there was a very strong correlation between the types of gender violence against men within within conflicts or genocidal scenarios, and the actual killing of the whole race. Um, in fact, she has this piece. She said that if we think about gender selective slaughters of specific racial groups of male civilians, that could be thought of as a warning to more generalized destruction and mass murder of the whole racial population, because it assumes that the murder of the whole group is soon to follow. So what we have here is a failure, right, among the black publics and the black intellectual class, because they can't seem to explain the narrative of civil rights progress and that they've held historically, and this new era of right wing authoritarianism that has wholly and completely refuted the ideological basis of racial progress in America. So when you think about black men, the black male is kind of a reminder, right, of this failure that we have in American politics. And it eats away at our conscience. So a white man is killed for his views. And this is something that Baldwin said, right? That if you have a white man stand up and proclaim, give me life, death, liberty, and he is killed, he becomes a martyr for those symbols. But if you have a black man saying exactly the same thing, there's a rush to kill the nigger so that no one will be like him. So what we have here is a complete difference of being. And one of the reasons that I'm constantly talking about dehumanization, because not as a rhetoric, but as an actual social position and location of black males in the United States, is because there is no explanation that any academic discipline has given us to understand why you can assassinate someone like Martin Luther King, Medgar Evers, Darian Seals, Mike Brown on public streets. And those deaths, those black male corpses become celebrated as symbols protecting the society. Whereas white supremacists who are killed, white supremacists who are met with the force or reactions from their views become liabilities not for some kind of form of degraded thinking, but heroes, right? They become symbols of what America should be. So the black men that have historically fought for freedom, who have given their lives for the advancement of black people and oppressed people around the world, become indicted for that courage. We condemn them for standing up against the system. And they're condemned by the very people that look like them, that believe that you should work within the system and be rewarded by white oppressors as the base, and that should be the basis of black liberation. But the humanity of white people, regardless of what they think, they could be anti-Semitic, they could be anti-black, they could be anti-left, they could be anti-liberal. Their lives have value no matter the stake. So whereas you had black feminists like the woman who wrote for For Harriet said, I'm not going to march for black men because I think they're too violent. The life of black males become negotiable. They become something that you're able to debate about. We now have people that are indicting Martin Luther King because evidence of his extramarital affairs or his sexual history have come out. You see people indicting Fred Hampton, Huey P. Newton. The list goes on and on and on. But the same people will not indict slave owners. They will not indict rapists. They will not indict people who built the fortunes of all of Europe, the America, and the UK on the genocide of African people. So it tells us something about the way that blackness operates, not in terms of a political concept. I mean here at the level of consciousness. We are affected by an illness that tells us that black life and death are basically the same. That we have the power as black people to determine whether or not a black life is worth mourning or even mention. But no one else in the world works that way. Political assassinations and violence against white people are strict violations of the expectation that American democracy operates to protect white life. But black people, be they intellectuals or the everyday layperson, has no such expectation when they talk about black people. So black male deaths, these are normalized. They're routine. A black man doesn't say the right language. He doesn't speak in the right tone. He doesn't hold the right identity politics. As we've been seeing online with Darian Seal, his life meant nothing. See, the smallest indictment of a black man's character invalidates the value that his life has had. And what I find to be most offensive about this idea is that standard does not apply to any other group of people. That if you don't hold the same idea or don't share my political sentiment, then your life means nothing. And this is part of the psychological and the overall political climate of the United States. Regardless of how radical black intellectuals claim to be, at the heart of it, at the very core of their creed, is the belief that some black people, specifically and disproportionately black men, should be sacrificed for the betterment of a certain elite group of people that represent the black race. And this is the dark secret of American politics that we don't really want to discuss. Black male studies didn't come about as a reaction simply to feminism. It was a reaction to the anthropological assumption that black men who die are nothing more than numbers because it's become so normalized within both our culture and our intellectual paradigms. So how do you change or how do you bring significance to the lives of groups of people that you don't believe are fundamentally human? That's the question, right? What we see happening under Trump isn't new. And every time I open Facebook, I'm somewhat stunned. I'm shocked because we've seen decades of black men and boys being murdered and shot in the streets. We've seen brothers' bodies covered in blood on sidewalks in the heat of St. Louis. We've seen American pavement and cement stained, right, with the blood of our people, our young men and boys. And the kinds of reflection, the accusations of fascism and tyranny have not crossed the lips of many black pundits. We've had movements that were allegedly talking about the rights, claiming to be the new civil rights movement with BLM. And fascism wasn't mentioned as the basis upon which we're talking about the destruction and the invalidation of black male life. But all of a sudden, because white liberals have now been affected by the tyranny of a right wing authoritarianism, fascism is rolling off of the tongue of practically every black pundit, academic, and layperson. It's spread to activist spaces. So I asked myself, well, then what was the difference? Huey P. Newton, Bobby Seale understood that fascism had its roots in racism. They understood that dehumanization and the invalidation of certain groups of people's rights was a slippery slope to invalidation of all groups of people's rights that were not in power. This is well stated even by Stokely Carmichael in Black Power. But those words, those treatises didn't make a difference to the intellectual climate of today. But the minute that white liberals suffer, they give the black intellectual class permission to use these kinds of words. It's truly sickening because we're looking at our own people die. We watched that happen for over a decade, and then when the mass force, right, of political repression came against all black people under the second term of Trump, we act surprised. Right, that's what Amy Randall's saying. That if you kill that the test ground of genocide is killing male civilians, right? Adam Jones, Earl Miller talk about this as a gendercidal moment. You eliminate the men that could possibly be dissidents, militants, and combatants. And that paves the way for the at-large repression of the whole racial group. Now think about the second coming of Trump and ask yourself, was not the murder, the invalidation, the socialization of the public to be completely non-sympathetic to the deaths of black men, does that not aid the moment has been created by Trump right now? Right? The dismissal of life, specifically black life and black male life, was something that was tried over a decade ago. But nobody wanted to make the connection because black elites and white liberals were dictating the terms both of the government and the terms of American democracy and black representation. And now that those people are no longer in power, we see the same political violence that's been exacted on our people for over a decade, that's been caught on camera, publicized, and people making memes of, becoming the major dividing line in the United States because it's being applied to white people. We should be disgraced at the conceptual and intellectual failure and the inability that we've had to describe this moment accurately, given our allegiance to this notion of racial equality.
I want to get into a question that I've had for a while. I know we've talked about this on other episodes, but I love to get into it in the context of what's been happening over the past couple of days. Everything you said and all the data, as I said at the top of the show, points to the severe disadvantages that black men have in the United States.
Hmm.
This is data that has been correlated. This is data that's been processed. This is data that's been researched for at least since the 1960s and probably
Yes.
beyond, but codified since the 1960s.
Hmm.
So my question is, with all this data and with all this evidence to the situation that the majority of black men find themselves in, how and why are black men still thought of as privileged despite all this data to the contrary when all the evidence completely goes against that? It doesn't make any sense to me, and I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Well, you have to remember that the people that's advancing the narrative of black male privilege are doing so from an ideological basis that justifies their own class and institutional position. When you go into black neighborhoods and black communities, black people are not rushing to take the place of black men by any stretch of the imagination. Within our own working class communities, we understand that black men are not privileged and that they're institutionally targeted. When I was a young child growing up in Louisiana, My mom would always tell me that, the system targets you. They're going to try to criminalize you. They're going to tell you what you think. So you have to be strong enough to recognize who you are and what you think. And what we've done currently is have an ideological battle that's being dictated disproportionately by people in the humanities and liberal arts that have no regard for data. Right? I mean, you have to remember, right? The attack on liberal arts in the United States by the right is almost solely on the basis of his ideological currents, right? So the notion isn't that liberal arts itself is useless. The argument is liberal arts is useless because it's a leftist political agenda, right? And that's very important because before the 1960s, liberal arts was not a liberal political agenda because it was interested in building up kind of the core foundations of white supremacy, right? You studied European languages, French, German, Greek, Latin, because these were evidence. This was evidence of the superiority of white civilizations over all other civilizations. It's not until the Harvard report after the civil rights era where people were being disrupted, right, from the Vietnam War and the Black Power and Civil Rights movement, that there were certain kinds of core curricula that were put in place at universities that privileged theory and certain forms of deconstruction and literary analysis over political and economic analysis. And that was very deliberate, right? That was deliberate because what you were trying to do is create an academic class that was not politically motivated and willing to get out into the streets as you had within the 1960s and 70s, where people were reading Fanon, were reading Marx, etc. So we have to understand the intellectual climate that brings us to what we have today. The notion that black men have privilege hasn't had to answer the data. In fact, most of the people in liberal arts and humanities will claim things like, utilizing data is patriarchal or utilizing data is positivistic. I mean, these people don't know what these terms really mean, but that's the accusations if you believe in any sort of any form of empiricism, which is strange because you have to remember that when you talk about black studies and the black intellectuals who brought about the study of black people, they were all empiricists. They were sociologists, historians, and psychologists. So what we've entered into, and this is very, very important. I write about this in chapter 3 of The Man Not. What we have entered into is a sharp division and conflict between a black intellectual class that uses theory to justify its political position within white liberal institutions, and a group of black intellectuals and a black public and black communities that suffer from the material, political, and outright violence that American liberal institutions and right wing institutions use to keep societal order. So those two things aren't in conflict in the academy because they're completely separate. There's no interaction between the two. Theory does not answer to evidence. It answers to the at-large belief and consensus that other scholars and other politicians and opinion makers have to the theory or the ideology that's at play. And let me just say how incredibly dangerous this is. The strategy among black liberals has been to operate within the ideological paradigms that have been set forth by white liberals throughout most higher education institutions. Remember, the argument about black male privilege comes from the black academic class. It comes from the early, Bell Hooks, Patricia Hill Collins, Kimberly Crenshaws, etc. And it's picked up and then it's kind of proliferated throughout gender studies. And it's become the intuitive basis by which we understand black men in the United States today. But notice what's happened currently. Black liberals are no longer in power. So that means that the ideas of black male privilege only resonate among a sect of disempowered liberals. That's important because when you compare how the right looks at black men, they identify them as biological and cultural threats. And I think this is where we have to start becoming more sophisticated. Be it the left or the right, they're both white supremacist ideologies. The disagreement between the left and the right is about how you dominate, rule, and contain a distant population. So, given that, if you have right wingers who are now mandating increased militarization, You have increased criminalization. You see what Trump did in DC and what he's now trying to justify more broadly after the killing of the young Ukrainian woman. You have to think, does privilege make sense given that they're now utilizing language that suggests that it is, again, young, poor, black males who are the greatest threat to white safety within American cities and communities? So the notion of privilege that white liberals use to dominate and keep black men out of higher education institutions, government jobs, affirmative action agendas has been destroyed and is being replaced with a very brute and realistic application of political and military force that's trying to rid communities and cities of urban black males.
I'm glad you brought this up from a political standpoint because if you look at the history of this demonization of black males and the idea of black male privilege, if you look at the history of this in other countries, you can see where this has been tried in other places. It was tried in Iran after the revolution of 1979. It
Hmm.
was attempted in just recently in Palestine, where you saw a sort of like weaponization of feminist theory
Yes.
or weaponization of feminist ideals in cultures that are completely alien to that, to say
Hmm.
that because these regimes have restrictions on the women in those cultures, or there are certain cultural ideas set up in those countries, that those women are oppressed and the men are oppressing them. And it's kind of interesting because you see that that didn't work with the Iranians in the early 80s. And even just recently, you saw LGBTQ Palestinians and Palestinian women being very vocal about the fact that they want the rest of the world and they want the West to stop demonizing their men because they understand that they're in a fight for survival against the regime or against the power structure that wants the destruction of their culture. So, my question to you before we move on is how was that ideology able to flourish so well in Black Americans and Black American academia and in Black American culture when it
Hmm.
failed in cultures like Palestine and it failed in the Middle East?
No, that's a great question. I mean, these of course, this is a theoretical argument, but I mean, I think the main reason is because those groups of people have a fundamentally different worldview. So, and here's what I mean by that. So, one of the great books that I really like by an author named Joseph Messiah, where he talks about this very issue, Islam and liberalism. He discusses the way that the West tries to misread the Middle East, right? And he explains that when you look at the actual culture of Muslim groups, that you see that the meaning that they have within the cultural group is fundamentally different than the perception that places like the United States or Europe have of that group. So you have an internal dialogue and a very adamant anti-West culture that is problematizing Western imperialism, both in terms of its ideology and its political and military intervention. In the United States, Black people are trapped within the geography of the West. They are ruled and managed by white institutions, a majority white population, and they're educated within white dominant university structures. Well, what does that mean? It means then that the overarching basis by which Black people will understand themselves goes against what they take to be the political current of integrationism and racial progress. I'll say that differently. Whereas other groups are separate and have their own culture, language, and land, for Black people to reject these ideas means they would have to give up the idea of being viewed as equal and integrating into American life, culture, and institutions. So, because Black people are seeing and measuring racial progress through their ability to hold jobs in white corporations, to gain positions in institutions like white universities and other higher ed entities, and because they want to participate in a white economy, there is not a strict separation between white culture and black culture to the extent that black people have the power and the means to reject what white culture imposes onto it. That means that when you have an ideology such as black men are savages versus what they say what they're saying about the Middle East, Muslim men are savages. Black people are more susceptible to this idea because they're indoctrinated with it within white universities, secondary schools, etc. They're taught by their oppressor. In the Middle East, you have completely different sentiments towards the West, where they're trying to keep out white liberalism, white leftism, and white colonial and imperial discourses that demonize Islam or their cultures. The problem that Black people have is our susceptibility to white ideas. And the way that white ideas such as feminism, liberalism, or even this kind of racial progressivism that says we should integrate and reform white supremacist systems, the problem is that we don't have an ability to fundamentally reject that because we put it in blackface and then utilize it as if it's our own voice. And you have to remember, look at the dominant discourse that we have about blackness in the academy. In the liberal arts, we have people utilizing psychoanalysis developed by white racist thinkers as being able to describe what black people, specifically black men, desire. You'll have the same people reject statistics, sociology, or history for a theoretical conjecture that says that black people or black men only want power and rape. So if you have black academics that take ownership of these white supremacist theories and claim that these are the only mechanisms by which we can examine blackness, right, through desire, power, and pathology, then what you get at the end, what's the outcome or product of that is going to be a group of black people dictating how broken black people are. So they're susceptible to this language. That's not going to be the case when you necessarily look at certain African populations, certain Arab populations, certain other populations that have their own people, own history, own economies, etc. And as much as black academics and politicians want to talk about empowerment and represent themselves as radicals, you notice how far out of line they actually fall compared to other great thinkers of our time. For example, if you look at Franz Fanon asks, why does the black bourgeois or the black academic, right? The black bourgeois, the African bourgeois, operate in such a way that they are kind or perpetuate the ideas of the colonialists, right? If you look at E. Franklin Frazier, who says, well, what's the failure of the black intellectual? They don't study their own culture. They imitate the issues and the ideas of the dominant white culture. You look at Du Bois. Well, the failure of American democracy is that it's capitalistic. Black people don't have a home here. Our home and our natural brotherhood and alliance is with Africa. You see, every great black thinker pointed out the same kinds of susceptibility to white arguments that I'm pointing to. But that becomes frowned upon today as a part of black political analysis because the de facto assumption is that black people are best served when their interests align with white liberals. And it's a false assumption that I think that we see under Trump, how dangerous it is. Because now we have no cultural and political mechanisms to protect our own people, especially our black men, from the ongoing and the upcoming criminalization of them that's going to lead to more black male death and vastly more black male incarcerations.
All right, before we move on, I want to do a little bit of house cleaning. If you're just coming into the space, this is the Black Male Studies session, episode 3, looking for black male privilege. We're here with Dr. Tommy J. Curry, author of The Man Not. And also, this space and this series is sponsored by the African American Men's Historical Society. The AMHS is a Black American Men's Intellectual Society focused on the preservation, history, and empowerment of Black men. Go to amhis.org to learn more and visit their Substack at amhis.substack.com. I want to get into something along the lines of what you just said, tied into data and also tied into rhetoric. Um, According to data, and if you go up in the Jumbotron, you can read along as well. According to data published last Friday from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the unemployment rate for Black men is currently at 7.1%, higher than the 6.7 unemployment rate seen for Black women in August, although the media attention was focused on the 365 jobs lost by Black women. Black men as a demographic are at the highest risk of suffering incarceration at some point in their lifetimes. Men commit suicide 4 times more than women. and the rate of young men committing suicide has risen 30% over the last decade. This is a crisis by any stretch of the imagination, but there seems to be a collective ignoring of this data by the academy and also by the system. So my question is, why are the social disadvantages of black men not configured in government policy or political movements?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of theories about this. I'll tell you what I think. I think that the black male represents a population associated with danger and revolution and resistance. And the best way to contain that is through lessening its demographic potential, both politically and in terms of raw numbers. So, one of the things that I think happened after the Black Power movement and the Black Civil Rights movement, and you can actually see this deliberately stated, right, by white feminists, people like Shulamit Firestone and Brownsmiller, was the need to associate any attempt of black men to resist as a quest for power, patriarchy, and domination over women. Now, while that may have come about, that specific language utilizing psychoanalysis came about in the 1970s. This was an argument that was made all the way back during slavery and colonial times, like the late 1800s. Because the argument was that in order for us to save and bring civilization to the rest of the world, we had to kill all the men and you had to impregnate and re-educate the women. So this idea has been a reoccurring and repetitive pattern of thinking among how colonial states and European nations have sought to conquer uh, black people and other racial groups. My student, professor or Dr. Gilmore has wrote an excellent dissertation on this idea as a form of counterinsurgency. So that being said, it's not really surprising that the numbers that you've just mentioned are ignored in terms of policy because we're dealing with an American political system that I truly believe aims not only to stamp out and murder black males, but also denigrate their character to such an extent that there can never be another black male leader or group of leaders like we saw under the civil rights movement or during the black militant or the black power era. And this is very, very deliberate. So what we see is an embrace of a form of social engineering and a domestic genocide in many ways. So even if you look at the work, you mentioned, the idea of how much black men are making to the dollar. I mean, back in the day, I think this was around 2020. Raj Chetty, he won the Clark Medal in economics. Wrote an article on race and economic opportunity in the United States. And what he showed was that even if you have black men that are born into the upper middle classes, because of discrimination and the stigma against black males, they have the highest rates of downward mobility. Now, this is an exceptional finding because what it means is that the discrimination, the institutional and cultural discrimination against black males in the United States is so high that even when black men are said to have middle class or upper class economic privilege over other groups, they're the most likely to be punished and to be pulled down so that they end up in a class below them. So this tells us something about the intent of the operation of the structure. We're not dealing, the mistake that we've made in developing political theory is that we've made it an aspiration for a world that we would like to see where black people are treated equally. What we have failed to do, and you can see this in the peer review literature, is develop a system that explains both the coming political division, right, and polarization of America based on racism and the role that the murder, incarceration, and demonization of black men and boys plays in perpetuating that split. Remember, Trump is not making a blanket statement about white supremacy. He rarely ever talks about white supremacy. But what does he do? He talks about the dangers that other populations, specifically racialized male populations, be they Muslim or black or Mexican, have to white people and to white reproduction. And as much as people like to criticize black male studies for focusing on black men, there has not been another academic discourse that has both anticipated and explained the way that the demographic majority of white Americans, in fact, dictate their politics and dictate the amount of brutality and lethality they're willing to engage other groups with. So the reason these statistics and this data is not taken seriously is because the system that we live in America, this great American democracy people keep trying to tell us about, is quite compatible with the elimination and subjugation of racialized people and the absolute murder of black men and other racialized men to achieve the goal of white supremacy.
All right, we're gonna take a couple more. We're gonna get a couple more questions in, and if there's anybody who has, if you have time, who have want to ask Dr. Curry some questions, go ahead and put your requests in now so I can see you. And when we get towards the end of the conversation, then I'll pull some people from the audience if you have anything you want to say, or you have a question. Um, Dr. Curry, who benefits from this erasure of the socioeconomic plight of black men?
I mean, practically everybody. You know, the economy is not closed, and I think you can see quite clearly that when Trump decided to eliminate all those jobs that black women were holding under the Biden administration, he replaced them with white men. You see, this is not a theoretical, right, conjecture about what the world would look like if we're right. What we're doing is saying the world keeps giving us certain kinds of outputs. How do we explain the variables that are producing that? Right? We see increased criminalization of black men. We see the utilization of basically martial law and militarism in urban cities under Trump. We see increased deportations. We've seen Fox News pundits say, "Get rid of all the Latino men, keep the Latinas." Right? Because we can reproduce with them. This language isn't going anywhere. It's just that people aren't paying attention. So everyone benefits if you get rid of black men, if you get rid of racialized men, Latinos, Muslims, etc., white people as a whole benefit. And what I think is the most frustrating about our commentary, be this from MSNBC, CNN, etc., is that when they talk about racism, they're only talking about the outrageousness of what white liberals think is racist. They're not talking about how there's literally a terraforming happening in the United States. Notice what's going on. What Trump is laying out is a plan that produces both a cultural, ideological, political, and economic structure that fundamentally and structurally benefits white people into perpetuity, right? So for the next, think about it. So for every loss that black people have taken over these last 8 months, they solidified a structure where white people no longer have to learn about histories of slavery or black resistance, where white people no longer have to compete with black people or other racial ethnic minorities for jobs, where there's been a reinstitution of the importance of white women reproducing for the white race, and where black people, brown people, or anyone else who dares to stand in the way will either lose their jobs or their lives. So, who does that benefit over the next 50 years? Will the white population numbers go up? Will my racial ethnic minorities either have to live in small enclaves where they feel they have no political power, like what's going on in Texas, or will they have to leave the country? He is fundamentally changing the structures of how black people now have to think and operate within the United States. And for all the liberal hopefuls that are out there thinking that this is just going to be about the change of a presidency, the Supreme Court lasts a lifetime. They will still enforce and uphold the stare decisis that were solidified under Trump. So we have to think more seriously and carefully about what the elimination of black men, both socially as a demographic and population, and economically mean for the ability of the white race to reproduce itself and to claim absolute dominion over all the major institutions in the country. That's not the level of analysis that I think we have at the moment.
So where does that leave the people, the black people in academia and in media and in the pundit class who are deeply invested in the idea of black male privilege if this comes to pass?
Unemployed? I mean the language. I mean you can see it now, right? The language still exists within the small class of black people who are having the argument. But even white liberals haven't really been talking about gender in that way because it's banned. You see, this is what I mean. Look at the power that ideological coercion and the state have to dictate what academics say. You haven't seen any, there was the Me Too movement. People were out in pink hats. You haven't seen any marches by white women against Trump for his sexism. Why? Because violence is a deterrent. You haven't seen a mass uprising of white liberals around the idea of patriarchy and fascism in universities. Why? Because they don't want to lose their jobs. So the question becomes, why then are black academics still pushing the language that white academics have abandoned for their economic safety and for their employment, to save their employment and jobs, right? Because the people that they're directing the argument to have no power. Right? When Obama was in office, Kimberly Crenshaw, black feminists, white liberals had no problem signing initiatives against My Brother's Keeper. There was an article every week about why Obama was a bad president or patriarchal or sexist. Trump deliberately claims that he's ethno-nationalist, that he's authoritarian, that he's sexist, that right? No one says anything. You don't say anything because the power differential between a white patriarch with the military at their disposal was completely different than what they thought that it meant for a black man to rule the state. So no one's going to question, right, the application of certain theories within a black group. Black academics largely don't matter in terms of the rest of the world. Like that's the reality that we don't seem to accept. When you travel Europe or you travel to the UK and even Canada, black academic work is not well represented. So that means that most of the things that black academics are thinking and talking about, while they may be discussed in other parts of the world, dictate very little of the intellectual currency that other universities throughout the world actually teach to their students. It's not seen the same way. So in the United States, the debates that black academics have with other black people are utilized in a very particular way by white liberals to discipline certain populations. And that's why you have the idea of privilege. Black male privilege did nothing but ensure that certain groups of black people were able to get jobs because white liberals believe that if you hire black men, they're either dangerous or undeserving. It was a way for different groups of academics to rationalize and moralize the discrimination against black males in employment and higher education, right? And that reality that's very central now, right? Because white liberals are no longer in power, where other black people, black women, black sexual minorities, etc., are all losing under Trump. What's the appeal? Who's privileging these black men? They don't lead in employment. They don't lead in education. They don't lead in exaction of violence, right? So what is the privilege? Right? Without the white liberal power broker, this language will eventually die out because we're moving much closer to segregation and to a Jim Crow slash apartheid system in America. And that language will not be able to explain the reality of black men and black people, no matter how adamant or deeply held it is by liberals and feminists.
All right. I want to open the floor up to brief Q&A if you have time, Dr. Curry.
Absolutely.
All right. So again, if you want to, if you have a question for Dr. Curry or you have questions about the things we discussed over the past hour, now's your time. Put your request in, put your hand up so I can see you, and I'll go around the room and grab the people I see with their hands up first. I see some people I haven't seen in a while. Shout out to Dr. Tia Son Johnson in the building. He's a very, really solid Black male studies scholar. Y'all should get into as well. But let's get into the Q&A. I'm gonna go with Philosopher King Javion, 8BZ. Myron, how you doing, brother?
Good, good. Just enjoying the commentary. I wanted to ask, as Dr. Curry was talking, I was reminded, especially in the beginning when he was talking about the condemnation we have for black men who exhibit courage and resist oppression. And I was reminded of a passage from Huey Newton's Revolutionary Suicide where he talks about this dynamic going back to slavery and the
Mhm.
slave mother being incentivized to discipline her children to adapt into the system. But I wanted to know from Dr. Curry, I mean, does he think this dynamic of population management is unique to slavery? And if so, what differences happen after integration, after the crushing of the Black Power movement? Because I did hear you
Mhm.
mention that as well, right? That like there's a new intensity to it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I think. I think one of the problems that we have is that we don't study slavery in comparison to other systems of dehumanization or genocide. Um, I view slavery against black people as an act of war against black African people around the world. It changed population density. It changed economic and knowledge capital. But yet we don't have a lot of research that's looking at that. So, but if we start from that basis, if I start with that given presumption, then I think what you're saying is true. That look, Newton is looking at the inhibition to black resistance, specifically black male resistance, because Newton, the same way you get with George Jackson, so that brother, understand that black males are disproportionately targeted by the state. I think even Robin Spencer makes this point in her book. So, given that, black mothers are trying to enable or I guess increase the chances of survival, right? Because as Newton says in Revolutionary Suicide, the revolutionary can only expect death. And as Jackson says, the only thing that comes with revolution from the revolutionary is early funerals and bullets. So I think what changed in integration, and I think you can see this very well in the establishment of the core curricula. And I think I've mentioned before, the work of William V. Spanis and even Sylvia Winter on this issue is you saw a new way to divest black people of a revolutionary ethos. And the way that would happen was to say that every black male revolutionary was psychotic, as they did with the protest psychosis, a rapist, as Shirley Firestone, said in her book on the dialectics of sex, or a danger to women and the black community at large, right? Which is what you got from Bell Hooks. I think the combination of those kinds of deployments and the overarching framework and adoption of intersectionality as a way to diffuse Black radical sentiment and push reformism and coalitions became the basis upon which integration became an extremely useful mechanism of neocolonialism. But I mean, this. This is the same argument that internal colonization theorists make, right? So that I don't think that part's new. I think what's important for us to realize is the role that the murder and demonization of black men play in kind of creating a pacifist and reformist agenda within the black elite and academic class.
All right, did he answer your question, Myron?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Let's go on to the brother Rennie Toure, one of my favorite people on the app. One of the brothers who always holds it down for black male studies and pushes people with data, even though some people hate data like it's a vampire with a cross. But Rennie, the microphone is wild in here sometimes.
Got
It's
you,
wild in
got
here,
you.
Doc, sometimes. You got the mic, Rennie.
Appreciate the floor. And thank you for having this discussion, man. It's really dope discussion. My question is almost it's very similar to what Myron was asking, slightly
Mhm,
different. How important would you say, because you mentioned it on the tail end of what you were speaking on, how important would you say internal colonial theory is to dissipating this understanding of black male privilege? And what I mean by that is, for example, when you read a Robert Allen,
mhm,
you see that there's a certain way in which quasi militant rhetoric can be incorporated into the white supremacist apparatus. So, for example,
mhm.
even CORE was funded by Ford Foundation, and in some respects, this rhetoric is assimilated in a similar way that you get these quasi progressive rhetoric, such as like intersectionality.
Yeah,
And because of that, this rhetoric is allowed to persuade certain kinds of black intellectuals uh, and the black masses, and it's to the deep detriment of the black masses as well. And so my question is more so, how is the understanding of internal colonial theory a means of dissipating the way that we think about intersectional thinking?
that's a great question. Uh, First, I mean, I think we have to make the distinction between what Alan's saying and someone like Blonder. So, assuming that we're working with Alan, I think that he shows that there's an investment in configuration within kind of a neo-colonial and internal colonial apparatus for Black people to have a stake in their social position. So there's always been a black petite bourgeoisie. We see this even in actual colonies. There are people who are closer to the means of production and the imperial home that can benefit and do business with the colonizer. I think the same thing applies here in the United States. It's not an accident that every black pundit that is on MSNBC or CNN, certainly a decade ago, right? This is less so now under Trump, but certainly a decade ago, with like your Melissa Harris Perry's, Joy Reid came after your Maddows, et cetera. These people, platform people, are people that hold very liberal reformist agendas. Now, that means that the ideological mechanism of the colony that black people occupy in the United States strives for ideological consistency. So, in other words, if you want black people to be ruled in a certain way, then what you show is the successful black intellectual or black pundit or black government leader or politician that can advance on this narrative and on this view. And what you have in the academy specifically, right? And I think Alan does a really good job talking about this. But George Jackson talks about this in Blood in My Eye. He says, look, if you're educating students and you think university is going to teach people how to destroy society, you're a fool. Because the function of the university is to produce people that can occupy institutions and maintain the status quo or the social order that requires both a class and racial subjugation. So what you have from black liberals and black progressives is the exact same thing, the striving for an ideological coherence that ironically, right, but unsurprisingly, mirrors exactly what comes out of the civil rights movement. So there's no intellectual diversity really among the black intellectual class. You may have black humanists and black anti-humanists like Afro pessimists, but at the end of the day, that's not an answer for the interpretation of material conditions. It's an argument about the analytic. Are we human? Are we slave and non-human? While that's interesting rhetorically and as a conceptual exercise in metaphysics, it doesn't tell us how to re-socialize whole groups of people, which was the interest of someone like a Fanon or a Robert Allen or even a Robert Staples and a W.E.B. Du Bois. Remember, Derek Bell utilized internal colonization theory precisely to show that racism was a permanent mechanism where black people, because they were an internal colony, did not have the power to dictate America's government, politics, or economic structure. Well, I think the same thing holds true now, that the strength of internal colonization theory is that it explains why black people are not allowed to hold institutional power, why black people, no matter if every one of them from age 0 to death voted a certain way, right, it wouldn't change the outcome. And while black people are always managed through violence, deprivation, and political neglect. No other academic system that we have, no other theory that's come about in the last 30 or 40 years explains that. Remember, intersectionality says we should be dependent on coalitions with our oppressor. Trump comes in, the white liberals are no longer in power. What happens? No intersectionality theorists are leading any charges against the state. Why? Because it's completely dependent on white liberal funding and recognition. So now we're thrown back into this world where we have to think anew what systems and ideas best explain our situation. And I think internal colonization theory is certainly on that list.
All right, Rainy, did you answer your question?
For sure. Definitely.
All right, so let's move on to another speaker. This is Khadijah. Khadijah's been in the spaces quite a few times and appreciate her coming through. So, Khadijah, the microphone is yours. What's your question for Dr. Curry? Khadijah, where you at? Unmute your mic. It looks like we might have lost Khadijah. Hang on one second.
Okay.
Khadijah, you there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I
Yes.
can hear me and you. So, yeah, you might need to drop your mic.
You're hearing me okay?
Uh huh.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so it's a pleasure to be in the space with everyone and Dr. Curry, you imparting your wisdom. What I wanted to kind of ask and maybe point out is that whenever people I notice have um, opposition to the work or they have like some deep sort of arguments against the work, they never really talk about Dr. Curry's theory of phallicism. And I find it interesting that they never bring up this theoretical point of view. Like they rarely ever debated Catholicism, which Dr. Curry posits that black men are both desired and also feared and hunted at the same time. And I just wanted to ask Dr. Curry why he thought that was. And I also wanted to kind of point to the fact that when we, talk about like black feminists, whether we're talking about Crenshaw or Firestone or Bell or any number of these people, they never really also discuss in their work that the masculinization of the Black Power movement and Black people as a whole. Whereas whatever you're doing, if fighting for your rights and you're going against the system with a thrust of resistance, that they are also looked upon by the broader sort of feminist structure as masculinized. Like they've taken
Mhm.
on the sort of essence of the very black male population that they want to sort of degrade in the eyes of white people. So I just wanted to kind of ask you, like why are these? They never really grapple with these concepts.
Yes. Well, I think there's a few reasons for that, to be quite honest. One is because I think that the amount of social, scientific, and historical evidence that Black male studies scholars have on these issues is overwhelming. It not only is supported by, say, Jim Sedanius's work, but Black male studies scholars have started looking at low level conflicts, military tactics, as Dr. Gilmore does, or the work I do on genocides, and it's just very obvious that masculinization is the primary and first way to justify the elimination of whole groups. To masculinize it, and this is what Black male studies scholars mean when we talk about racism as a misandric aggression. We mean that racism not only has a male target, but utilizes the negative stereotypes that it applies to males as being, say, rapists, deviants, criminals, etc. And they use that negative male stereotype to describe the whole race. So masculinization is kind of a necessary condition or component of at large discrimination and genocide and lethal extermination. And I think phallicism becomes such a problem because, look, I think when you read feminist responses, there's very few in the peer reviewed literature. But even when you read, someone like Douglas's response to Black male studies, what you find is a caricature, right? You see them, doing things like changing words and changing sentences and, creating, using psychoanalysis, creating, because they can't answer evidence. So phallicism, for instance, concedes that when a black man can't be a patriarch because he's thought of as a savage. So with any outgroup system, be it the Holocaust, the Armenian genocide, what happened in Rwanda, you always see the outgroup men both constructed as rapists and victims of rape, right? You see this in Palestine, right? You saw the idea that Palestinian men are rapists, attacking, sodomizing women, but they're also victims of rape by IDF female soldiers and male soldiers, right? And nobody wants to explain how this kind of contradictory force exists throughout all human societies and practically all racialized conflicts. And I think the reason that they can't answer it is because, remember, these are ideological systems. These are not serious arguments against a way of thinking. These are arguments in defense of a certain ideological system. So black male studies is a threat to both liberalism, humanist anthropology, and feminism because it suggests that the orientation we have towards racialized males is fundamentally mistaken. And on our side, we have statistics, epidemiology, history, and data. On their side, they have psychoanalysis and literature, the color purple. So that asymmetry of evidence is taken out in these very emotive and kind of ideologically driven, rants. And I would so that's why I think that happens. But the other thing I'd say about this is this: Black male studies outside the United States finds these concepts interesting because they don't necessarily mean the same thing they mean in the United States. See, in the United States, Black male studies is a threat because it fundamentally questions the class and intellectual position of the majority of Black liberals in the U.S. Academy. Well, outside the United States, there's not a whole lot of Black people, and the Black people that are in predominantly white academies don't have the same stake to their class position because there's so few. So saying that Black men are targeted by war, genocide, conflict, and that Black men and other racialized men are looked at this way is really a question of evidence, not ideology. So the U.S. Academy facilitates a kind of censure on Black intellectuals. There's a glass ceiling, so to speak, that we can't think beyond. So what do? We say the same thing over and over again. Anything that's Black and male and not feminist is trying to reclaim manhood, trying to focus on the penis, right? It's the demonization of Black men that we got from compensatory masculinity theory from the 60s and 70s. Well, why do we have that? Because that's what white liberals gave Black feminists to analyze Black men. In the rest of the world, that's not necessarily the case. So they don't mention it for two reasons. One, they can't refute it. It's empirically driven and is supported by data. And two, they can't answer it. Feminist ideology doesn't have a way to answer the contradictory findings of phallicism that we can see in practically every major human conflict based on race or ethnization in the 20th and 21st century. So it's just a matter of being overwhelmed by the evidence, I think.
All right. And last, but most definitely not least, we have a very special guest in the Q&A section. Everybody, say good afternoon to Dr. Tia Johnson. Dr. Tia Johnson is full professor of Africana Studies at California State University, Fresno. He is the founder of the Africana Studies online teleconference on Black Male Studies, the Onyx Black Male Film Festival, the Black Popular Culture Lecture Series and Online Research Archive, the Onyx Black Male Collective, the annual Ashe Sankofa Black Film Festival, the annual Africana Studies Black Gender Conference, the Africana Studies Black Elder Project, the Hip Hop Research and Interview Project, and the Black Male Studies blog. This brother got more credits than Ryan Coogler. What's good, Dr. Johnson? How you doing this morning, afternoon?
I'm good, man. I appreciate it. I'm in my office hours, and of course, as you're introducing me, students have started to walk in, so I have to condense what I wanted to say just to two quick things. So I appreciate you inviting me up to say a few things, Torrin. Thank you. You're my favorite journalist, and I meant it when I said it the first time. It's still the case now. But I wanted to say very
Oh wow, thank you.
quickly, first and foremost, I wanted to thank Dr. Curry for leading this push, not only for Black male studies, but to an empirical approach to Black male studies. I've been a professor for 27 years, and nothing has moved me as much as this last decade. Watching this push online and in the academy for resolving and clarifying what Black men are experiencing on empirical grounds. And I can't think of anybody who could have done a better job introducing that mode of research about Black men than Dr. Curry. So I first and foremost wanted to thank him for
No,
doing
thank you,
that.
brother.
And real quick, the second thing is I had a chance to talk to him the other night. I ain't gonna say whatever's coming. He can say it or not say it, but all I can tell you is this next year, what this brother has in the oven for us is all I can tell you is be ready. All I can tell you is be ready. He's got some goodies coming out, and I'm like a kid on Christmas morning waiting to open a package. So if you're not ready, get ready because it's about to get real interesting. So shout out to you and shout out to the brothers you've inspired who have come through here, myself included, that are still trying to build this up and expand it. But your work is invaluable, brother. Thank you.
Look, brother, thank you. I want to shout out Dr. Johnson real quick. Back in 2014, 2015, when I wrote the first article on Black male studies on Michael Brown, it was called a genre studies of the need for a genre study of death and dying. This brother was somebody that reached out to me and started conversations with me, and really supported the direction I was going and trying to create Black male studies. And I think it was 2015 or 16 when I was still at Texas A&M. Him and another brother named Calvin Warren really came to Texas A&M. They reflected on some of the ideas that I was putting together. and we're really at the foundation and helm of Black male studies. So, I'm always humbled by the respect, but it goes both ways. Dr. Johnson was an invaluable interlocutor and someone that supported the discipline, and his insights and support have been so central to Black male studies kind of taking the shape that it has taken today. So, thank you, brother.
All right. Go ahead, Dr. Johnson.
No, I was just gonna say I appreciate that. But that was it. But thank you, Torrin. Thanks, Doc. I'll holler at y'all later.
All right, man.
Oh, my pleasure. All right. Last question, Dr. Curry.
Yes.
How do we fix this? Can we fix this? What
Listen,
steps can we take?
Listen, man, it's what I said last time. Human agency is not a magic bullet, okay? Black people are going to have to hunker down and reorganize themselves and start making some very hard and clear-minded choices about where our allegiances and our loyalties lie. And I would strongly suggest that we give up this idea that we can change white America. The amount of casualties and the cost of our people's lives are are going to be immense. Um, so we have to re-educate our people. We have to organize in very specific pockets, and we're going to have to look for allies outside of the white liberal left. That means that international coalitions, people in the Caribbean, people in Africa, especially, looking for different ways and networks intellectually and politically outside of the United States. This is the same thing that happened during the civil rights movement. It happened a century before, when Black people started the American Negro Academy and other Black self-help organizations. We cannot continue to be dependent on white political and economic support during this period of time. And the one thing that I will say really briefly is there's a level of empirical reality that we have to grapple with. The minute that white liberals and leftist jobs were threatened in the academy and within government institutions, they have completely fell silent on race. That tells us something about intersectionality, coalitions, and the hope of reformism. While white people may be affected by Trump, their culture and their people are not being destroyed by it. In other words, you could be a white liberal today, and your children could be white conservatives, and they will have still benefited from what Trump's trying to do. That is not the case for our people. Our generations upon generations of our people will be victims of discrimination, isolation, and social ostracization. And that comes with a fundamentally different weight and a system of consequences that we have to take stock of and react against. So organization is key, socialization is key, and looking for international alliances and networks with similarly minded people outside the US. We've got to build up more Pan African, pan colorist, and international views and networks to fight against what's coming in the United States.
All right, and I think that's where we'll close it out for today. I want to thank Dr. Tommy J. Curry for being taking out of his valuable time and taking time out to have these conversations. I want to thank everybody who came through to listen, and I want to thank everybody who came up to the Q&A to speak. Really excellent questions and really excellent statements. This is going to be recorded, so it'll be out probably on YouTube in the next day or so. Hopefully, if I can edit this up, it'll be up by then. Again, shout out to everybody who came through. My name is Torraine Walker, and this has been episode 3 of the Black Male Studies Sessions. And shout out to the African American Men's Historical Society. If you want to learn more about the organization, go to amhis.org and visit their Substack at amhis.substack.com. Thanks again for everybody. My name is Torraine Walker. Y'all have a good rest of your afternoon. Be good.